What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here at FantasyPros, bringing you my top 10 waiver wire ads for week 15. This list is under 60% rostered, and if you watch my previous videos, you know that I like to try and keep the list to under 50%. But this week, I'm allowing us a little leeway of guys that are slightly over 50% because it is a special week, it is time to start the playoffs, and we need every guy that can help us win right now. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. Number 10, Austin Hooper. Austin Hooper had a solid outing this week, catching 5 of his 7 targets for 30 yards and 1 touchdown. The tight end position is actually very critical to Cleveland. You just wouldn't know it from a fantasy perspective because they use 3 tight ends, making none of them reliable for our purposes. But with David Njoku on COVID IR and Harrison Bryant out with an injury, Hooper paid off. If he's the only tight end this week, I feel confident starting him against the Oakland Raiders. Despite holding Travis Kelce to only 3 receptions for 27 yards last week, the Raiders typically give up a significant amount of points to fantasy tight ends. Number 9, Mike Davis. Let me start off by saying I feel like a complete hypocrite for putting Mike Davis on the list, but I do feel like the fade of Mike Davis and the distrust was justified. Weeks 7 through 13, Mike Davis was the RB 59 in full PPR in average points per game. That's behind guys like Adrian Peterson, Ty Johnson, Brandon Bolden, and Kenneth Gainwell. He was the RB 42 in total points scored, playing the maximum amount of games you could have possibly played over that time period. There was no logical reason to believe that this was a guy worthy of a roster spot. But for 2 weeks in a row now, he's been more productive, with an average points per game that would make him a low-end RB2. Do I trust it? No. But should we ignore it? No, we probably shouldn't. Because there is that Week 16 matchup against Detroit, and he could be a usable asset there. Number 8, Rashaad Bateman. Rashaad Bateman finally got that big breakout game we've been looking for. He caught 7 of his 8 targets for 103 yards. Sadly, it came after pretty much everyone dropped him, but the good news is that means that he is very available on waivers. Bateman is on the back end of my list because it's a little hard to say you can trust him when this game followed up 2 games where he was on the field for less than 50% of snaps and saw only 1 target last week against a very soft Pittsburgh defense. And it's hard to say that Bateman didn't maybe benefit from his routes and his skill set lining up a little bit more with Tyler Huntley, who played most of the game for an injured Lamar Jackson. But it's possible that Huntley plays again this week, and while the matchup against Green Bay's secondary isn't ideal, Bateman is worthy of an ad. Number 7, DeVante Parker. Don't forget about DeVante Parker. The Dolphins were on a bye this week, so we don't have any new stats to talk about. I'll just reiterate that while he is definitely the number 2 option behind Jalen Waddle, that's not exactly a bad position to be in. Since Tua Tagovailoa's return from injury, Tua has been a very stable, reliable quarterback, able to feed multiple fantasy-relevant players. And in Parker's return from IR last week, he caught all 5 of his targets for 62 yards. Not a bad return to action stat line. And the Dolphins face the Jets, Saints, and Titans. You could do a lot worse from a fantasy playoff schedule. Number 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown followed up a fantastic Week 13 performance with another very solid performance of 8 receptions on 12 targets for 73 yards. That's a total of 18 receptions and 24 targets over the past 2 weeks. St. Brown appears to be establishing trust and consistency with Jared Goff and asserting himself as the wide receiver 1 of this offense. Now, I'm sure the absence of TJ Hawkinson didn't hurt those numbers, and that matchup against Arizona next week isn't ideal, but I'm not going to ignore the late season emergence of a talented rookie. I may not be willing to roll him out against Arizona, but that game is followed up with Atlanta and Seattle, and those are 2 excellent matchups, and I might be more inclined to play him there as a flex option. Number 5, Russell Gage. This week's stat line was a little ho-hum for Russell Gage, catching 4 of his 6 targets for 64 yards. But Matt Ryan only completed 19 passes for 190 yards and 1 touchdown, so when you look at it that way, this was a decent floor on a low production game against a solid defense that came in this week ranked 5th in DVOA against the pass. I think this is exactly what we needed to see. If you watched last week's waiver wire video, you know the stats. Prior to this week, Gage was a top 10 wide receiver in PPR weeks 11 through 13. And prior to that, he went back and forth between being productive and giving us absolutely nothing. We needed to see that in a bad game script, he could still provide a solid floor. And the next 2 games are against San Francisco and Detroit. They are much more pass friendly, so he's a solid roster through the playoffs. Number 4, Justin Fields. Justin Fields' return to action was actually very promising despite the fact that they did lose the game. Fields completed 18 of 33 passes for 224 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Not fancy, but we've talked about this before. Rushing quarterbacks negate that low pass volume and turnovers. Fields had 9 carries for 74 yards, averaging over 8 yards per carry, and the result was a very productive day from a fantasy perspective. For comparison, take Jimmy Garoppolo, who had a productive day, completing 27 passes for 296 yards and 2 touchdowns with no interceptions, but only 1 carry for 3 yards since he's not a rushing quarterback. Their fantasy points were almost identical. Fields' upcoming matchups are against Minnesota and Seattle, teams that just gave up 300 yards and 3 touchdowns to Ben Roethlisberger and over 300 yards to Davis Mills. It's risky, but it could pay off for you. Number 3, KJ Osborne. KJ Osborne is another repeat from my list last week, as he is still very available on waivers. Maybe people just weren't familiar with the fact that he's been the clear wide receiver 3 in the Minnesota offense all season long. It just didn't really matter much because there was just way too much talent to feed Osborne, so his position was often unreliable and very irrelevant. But with Adam Thielen going down, KJ Osborne moved up to wide receiver 2 and saw a hefty 86% snap count, catching 3 of his 9 targets for 83 yards and a touchdown. Not bad on a day where Dalvin Cook was insane, rushing for over 200 yards, and Justin Jefferson saw 15 targets. Thielen's injury is a high ankle sprain, so the likelihood of seeing him in week 15 is low. Osborne is a must-add, especially facing a struggling Chicago defense. Number 2, Rashaad Penny. This was the Rashaad Penny we've been waiting for. 16 carries, 137 yards, 2 touchdowns, a spectacular performance. Now I will say, temper your expectations. This performance was against a Houston defense that has been ripped apart by the run week after week. So if there was a week for the Seattle run game to pull itself together, this was the week. But perhaps this wasn't just taking advantage of playing against Houston, because Alex Collins was active as well and had 7 carries for 16 yards, just barely over 2 yards per carry average, which pales in comparison to Penny. So against the same defense, Penny was simply more productive. It's very possible he's earned a leading role in this offense. The Rams are a tough matchup, so again, we might need to lower expectations for this week. But the following games are against Chicago and Detroit, so I would 100% want to roster Penny moving forward if he's the lead back in those 2 games. Number 1, Taysom Hill. For the second week in a row now, Taysom Hill tops my waiver wire list at only 50% rostered in Yahoo leagues. Taysom completed 15 of 21 passes for 175 yards, no interceptions but 2 fumbles, low volume and turnovers, but yet again, that doesn't really matter when you are a thriving rushing quarterback, because Taysom added 11 carries for 73 yards plus 2 touchdowns, making Taysom yet again a QB1. This was a soft matchup against the Jets, and next week, New Orleans faces a tough matchup against Tampa Bay defense. But if you look back to week 13, even in a tough matchup against a Dallas defense that has been a turnover machine, his upside carried him through. He's a solid option at quarterback and definitely worth a roster. And that wraps things up for this week's waiver wire ads. Thank you for watching, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros across all platforms, and come back next week for another round of waiver wire ads.